As we saw in our last episode, the John Birch Society strongly pushed for an Article 5 convention to propose the Liberty Amendments. So when did they do a complete 180 and start opposing an Article 5 convention, and why? If you thought they were hypocrites after watching the last episode of All Things Article 5, wait till you see the bomb I'm about to drop in this one. Get ready. This one will make your head spin and your stomach turn. Welcome to All Things Article 5, where we do a deep dive into the Constitution's amending provision to break through all the misinformation out there to get to the truth. Whether you're an Article 5 activist like myself or new to the subject and want to learn more, this is the place to be. So sit back and join me as we learn from the past, get engaged in the present in order to change the future. Now, in our last episode, we showed you how the John Birch Society advocated for using the convention mode in Article 5 to have the Liberty Amendment proposed by the state legislatures. All of this has changed, and now JBS runs a smear campaign against the framers and the Constitution to silence the voice of the American people and prevent the states from exercising their constitutional duty to protect our liberties. In the 1970s, the John Birch Society began opposing Article 5 efforts and have worked to rescind applications that were passed by the state legislatures to try to rein in our out-of-control federal government. Let me first explain what a rescission application is before we go any further. Once a state legislature passes an Article 5 application for a particular amendment or subject, that application remains active permanently unless a future legislature rescinds or basically cancels it. I highly recommend you visit the Article 5 library, which I'll provide the post for. This is a great resource for anyone working on an Article 5 convention and allows you to virtually see all the applications passed by the state legislatures and submitted to Congress since 1788. You can see the current count of each amendment application and also how many applications have been passed by subject or by state. You can also search to include rescissions that have passed to see whether or not that application still is active. So what changed? Why did JBS completely do a 180? Well, based upon what I have found, and it all begins with JBS leader John McManus. He is the first JBS official that I have been able to find that started spewing the myth of a runaway convention in order to create fear of the very process the framers gave us to restore the Constitution. This one gets really tangled, so we need to just kind of unpack it first. So for decades, the John Birch Society has been holding up as their, quote, constitutional authority against calling an Article 5 convention former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Warren Berger. They made him their poster child for their No Con campaign because of a few quotes he made claiming that a convention cannot be controlled.
Right. But Warren Berger's correct on that. And we've shown lots of people what he said, and he had been the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He isn't opposed to amendments. He expressed his opposition to a constitutional convention that would have power to void the entire Constitution. That's what he was opposed to. Right? Here's what Warren Berger said. The participants in the Constitutional Convention of 1787 had no authority to write a constitution. They were authorized only to revise the Articles of Confederation. But when they got to Philadelphia, they paid no attention to those limits and wisely threw the whole thing away and wrote the Constitution, right?
Now, Berger was no student of Article 5 by any means. And in his letters, he displays an ignorance of the facts surrounding not only the calling of the 1787 Federal Convention, but also the purpose of it. The John Birch Society, in their, quote, model resolution for a state legislature to rescind all constitutional convention applications, unquote, reference Berger along with another liberal former Associate Justice of the Court, Arthur Goldberg, as their, quote, constitutional scholars, unquote, for opposing the convention call. Let me demonstrate for you their hypocrisy by going to the Article 5 library and show you exactly what I'm referring to. I pulled up the Liberty Amendment, which we talked about in last episode, by selecting one of its subject of prohibiting federal commercial enterprises. I've noticed that the application for this amendment is listed under this category or repealing the 16th Amendment for the income tax. This one makes it easy to show you both the Article 5 application and rescission resolution. We're going to use Arizona. And if you notice, in 1979, Arizona passed the application for the Liberty Amendment. There are the 4 sections of it in this application, as you can clearly see. Then in just 4 short years, the legislature rescinded it. And looky there. There is the model language straight from the John Birch Society. These hypocrites rescinded their own amendment. Robert Welch must be turning in his grave. Okay, back to the topic of this episode. What was the reason JBS flipped on Article 5? I hope you are sitting down for this. The level of hypocrisy with this one is just, it's through the roof. So I'm going to unpack this point by point. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court decided on Roe v. Wade legalizing abortion. State legislatures began taking action to overturn Roe v. Wade by passing Article 5 applications to propose a right-to-life amendment. John McManus of the John Birch Society began opposing the right-to-life effort by making outlandish and unfounded claims that a convention would open a Pandora's box and that the convention would run away and throw out the entire Constitution. By 1980, 19 state legislatures passed applications for the right-to-life amendments, and they were well on their way to going to a convention. But the fear tactics employed by the John Birch Society and their alignment with groups on the left paralyzed the remaining states to reach the 2/3 needed. Here is John McManus bragging about how the John Birch Society helped to rescind Article 5 applications, including the right-to-life applications.
Rescissions, all right? Beginning in 1988, the John Birch Society and a few allies persuaded state legislators in 18 states to rescind all previous con-con calls. There were con-con calls for a balanced budget amendment. There was con-con calls against abortion, con-con calls against flag burning. In 1988, the John Birch Society and a few allies persuaded state legislators in 18 different states to rescind all of the previous con-con calls, whether it was for a balanced budget amendment or term limits or opposed to abortion or flag burning or whatever. Our attitude was simply that it doesn't matter what issue. If a state...
This is 20 resolutions that members of the John Birch Society are supposed to live by. And let me just show you number 4. I shall oppose in every practicable way that I can the widespread use or legalization of abortion or of euthanasia. They are openly defying one of their own resolutions by rescinding right-to-life applications, and they're still doing it today. Now, if you are a member of the John Birch Society, I want to talk to you. Why do you allow this to happen? This unfounded fear of a convention is prohibiting the states from introducing needed reforms that we could have had in place for decades. And our country would not be in the mess that it is in today. But thanks to the John Birch Society and groups that have joined with them, we have you to blame for the mess that we're in. Now ask yourself this simple question. Do you think the U.S. Supreme Court would be opposed to the state legislatures overturning one of their recent decisions? Do you also think that the Chief Justice that voted with the majority in the Roe v. Wade decision would be opposed to the states overturning his court's legacy ruling. Well, guess who the John Birch Society has propped up as their leader, their leading, quote, constitutional scholar to oppose the Article 5 Convention? Bingo, none other than Chief Justice Warren Berger, the very one whose court legalized abortion. You just can't make this stuff up. Now, I think it's clear. What Warren Berger, in my opinion, was doing was he was trying to create confusion over an Article 5 convention as opposed to a constitutional convention in order to prevent the states from overturning Roe v. Wade.
Mr. Chief Justice, what is your view of constitutional conventions per se? Would the convening of such a convention, in your opinion, pose a threat to our existing Constitution?
I don't think it would pose a threat. I think it would be a grand waste of time to have a constitutional convention to start all over. Here's the greatest, as many historians have said, the greatest document ever struck off. And even though it may have some flaws, it's had some. They've been remedied from time to time when the need arose. And there's one lurking in the background, the 27th Amendment. We can deal with these things one at a time.
There have been threats to have a constitutional convention to do something like that. What do you think about a constitutional convention?
Well, I've answered that a couple of times. You mean a whole new constitutional convention? A grand waste of time. And even worse than that. If there are specific problems, they should be addressed by specific amendments to that particular problem, and then let the American people decide them one by one.
Any fifth grader can read the text of Article 5 to see clearly that the convention only has the power to propose amendments to this current Constitution. It cannot rewrite the Constitution and adopt a new one. In closing, the constitutional scholar that the John Birch Society uses as their leading source to oppose an Article 5 convention, Warren Berger, whose court ruled on Roe v. Wade, also said this in regard to the Second Amendment.
If I were writing the Bill of Rights now, there wouldn't be any such thing as the Second Amendment.
Which says?
That a well-regulated militia being necessary for the defense of the state, the people's rights to bear arms. This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime. Now just look at those words. There is no real constitutional question here. The NRDA has convinced a lot of people that the right to bear arms is an absolute right. It is not, any more than the right to have an automobile is an absolute right.
Do you agree with Berger on this also? If you don't, perhaps you should ask yourself, why would you agree with him on an Article 5 convention? You see, folks, the source of your opposition, if you are against an Article 5 convention because you're getting your information from the John Birch Society, why? Why would you trust anything they have to say? Look at their sources. It's pure hypocrisy, nothing else. With all things Article 5, I'm Ken Quinn. Remember, experience must be our only guide. Fear will paralyze us. So fear not. Let's have some fun and let the truth prevail. Till next time.